The garage smelled like old motor oil and dry concrete, and Wyatt Harmon had long since stopped noticing. He sat on an overturned milk crate near the back wall, a bottle of water balanced on his knee, and stared at the car the way a man stares at something that belongs to another time, not with grief exactly, but with the kind of stillness that comes when a person has no idea what to do next. The car was a 1969 Dodge Charger, painted in a shade of deep forest green, so dark it looked almost black under the single hanging bulb. The paint had gone rough in patches, bubbling along the lower quarter panels where rust had found its way in, and the windshield wore a thin film of dust that had not been touched in months. There was no license plate, no registration card tucked in the visor, no paperwork of any kind in the glove box. What there was, as far as Wyatt had ever been able to tell, was the car itself solid, heavy, and stubbornly present in the way that old steel is present. It had sat in this garage for 11 years, and in all that time, it had never once started. His father had bought it in the summer of 1987 at a county auction in central Oklahoma, where half the lots were farm equipment and the other half were things people had stopped knowing what to do with. Raymond Harmon had paid $800 for the Charger, loaded it onto a flatbed with the help of two strangers, and driven it home without asking a single question about its history. He was a mechanic by trade and a careful man by nature. Careful in the sense of paying attention, not in the sense of being cautious, and he said two things about the car that Wyatt had carried for the rest of his life. The first was that the body lines were not quite right for a standard production model. Something about the hood clearance, the way the front subframe sat lower than it should, a detail that did not belong to any street car Raymond had ever worked on. The second was the instruction, given once and never repeated. Don't sell it before you know what you have. Raymond Harmon died of a stroke in the spring of 2012, leaving behind a mortgage that was almost paid off, a full set of snap-on tools, and the green Charger, sitting motionless in a garage that was now Wyatt's to lease and Wyatt's to worry about. Wyatt had kept all three, though the tools were the only ones that had earned back anything close to their cost. The problem with keeping the car was that keeping it required space, and space in Tulsa cost money. And money was the one thing Wyatt Harmon had never managed to keep ahead of for long. He worked as a licensed plumber, running a one-man operation out of a second-hand van with his name and license number stenciled on the doors in dark blue letters. In a good month, he cleared enough to cover the rent on the small house on the east side, the lease on the garage, 2 streets over, the liability insurance, and the payments on the equipment loan he had taken out 3 years earlier to replace a hydrojetter that had died in the middle of a commercial contract worth $12,000. In a bad month, he moved things around and hoped that next month would be better. The previous several months had not been better. The loan he was now behind on was not the equipment loan. It was an older one, a personal line of credit he had opened during the separation, when his ex-wife had packed 2 suitcases and left, and the legal paperwork had arrived shortly afterward in an avalanche that cost money he did not have. $14,200, borrowed in stages over 8 months, restructured twice with the bank's reluctant approval, and now sitting 90 days past due, with an institution that had finally decided that patience was no longer among the services it offered. He had known the letter was coming for weeks before it arrived. When it did, it came in a plain white envelope from an address he did not recognize. Charlotte Voss and Associates, 4th floor, a building on the west side of Midtown. Charlotte Voss had built her firm over 9 years into something efficient and quietly respected within the narrow professional world of civil asset recovery. She occupied 4 offices on the 4th floor of a glass and concrete building, employed 6 full-time staff and 2 contracted field agents, and maintained working relationships with 11 financial institutions in the greater Tulsa area. Her job, in the simplest description, was to finish the conversations that banks and creditors had started with people who could not or would not settle their debts through normal channels. She was 36 years old, trained as a paralegal before moving into recovery work in her late 20s, and she had a way of speaking in meetings that some people described as calm and others described as cold, though the distinction had never seemed important to her. She had built the practice on a single working principle. The process existed for a reason. The process had rules, and following the rules precisely was the only way the outcome was defensible. Sentiment was not a financial instrument. She did not hate the people who sat across from her in the conference room. She simply did not allow their circumstances to alter the arithmetic. The Wyatt Harmon file arrived at her desk via a community bank that had a volume referral arrangement with her firm, and it was a small account by any measure. $14,200, 2 restructurings, 90 days past due. Her intake associate ran the standard asset search within 48 hours. The house was rented, the van was leased. The tools held a junior lien from the equipment note. The only clean, tangible asset in Wyatt's name was a 1969 Dodge Charger, listed in probate records as transferred from the estate of Raymond Harmon in 2012, currently held in a leased garage at an address in East Tulsa. Charlotte's contact at a salvage estimating service put a phone assessment on it without seeing the car, $300 to $500 as scrap, based on year and model. The team logged it as a minor supplemental asset and moved on. Charlotte sent the 14-day notice by certified mail the following morning. Wyatt went to see her on the 3rd day after the letter arrived, having spent the first 2 days deciding whether it would make any difference. He had never been inside the building before, and the lobby had the particular smell of commercial air conditioning and new carpet that he associated with places where decisions got made about people who were not in the room. The conference room Charlotte used for client meetings had a long table, comfortable chairs, and a window that faced the parking structure next door. She was already seated when he arrived, a folder open in front of her, a pen laid across the top edge with the precision of someone who arranged things as a matter of habit. He sat across from her and explained, as clearly as he knew how, that the car was not an ordinary salvage vehicle, that his father had believed it was something unusual, that a mechanic with 40 years of experience had spent real time looking at it and decided it was worth protecting. He told her he had not had the money or the time to investigate the car properly, but he believed the $300 scrap assessment was wrong and that he needed more time to find someone who could tell him whether his father's instinct was correct. Charlotte listened to all of it without interrupting, her pen untouched, her expression neither sympathetic nor hostile. When he finished, she told him that the recovery timeline was set by the terms of the debt instrument and could not be extended on the basis of unverified belief in a vehicle's potential value. She said it in a way that was not unkind, measured, direct, without any satisfaction in it, and she offered him information about a debt counseling service in case the situation extended beyond the current file. Wyatt thanked her for the meeting, which was the automatic politeness of a man who had been raised to be courteous, even when he had nothing to be courteous about, and walked back to the van in the parking lot. He sat there for a few minutes before starting the engine. He spent the next 11 days doing everything he could think of, which turned out to be a list shorter than he had hoped. He photographed the car from every angle he could manage in the garage's limited light and posted the images on 3 online forums dedicated to Mopar restoration and vintage Dodge vehicles. The responses came in over 48 hours and were mostly polite and mostly useless. Without a visible VIN plate, without provenance paperwork, without any documentation of the car's history, beyond the word of a dead man, no serious collector or authenticator would make a move. One respondent, who identified himself as having 30 years in the Mopar hobby, told Wyatt directly that the car looked like a standard production Charger with some modifications done by a previous owner, and that without documentation, the market would treat it accordingly. He tried a different approach on the 4th day, driving to the county records office and requesting every document associated with his father's estate probate filings, the informal title transfer, the original auction receipt from 1987. The auction receipt listed the car as a 1969 Dodge Charger, one item in a lot of 6 miscellaneous vehicles sold for a combined price. There was no seller identification beyond a lot number, no history prior to the auction, nothing that told him anything his father had not already told him in the 2 sentences he had said about the car in his entire life. Wyatt folded the papers back into the envelope and drove home without stopping. Wyatt visited a restoration shop on the north side of Tulsa, whose owner had a reputation for knowing old muscle cars, and the man walked around the Charger twice and then told him, not unkindly, that he did not purchase vehicles without paperwork, because the legal exposure was not worth it. Two regional collector associations received calls from Wyatt on the same afternoon. One did not call back. The other called back on the sixth day, asked to see more photographs, and then went silent again. He contacted a retired Chrysler engineer, whose name had appeared in an online forum thread about production-era Dodge modifications, left a voicemail explaining the situation, and received no response. On the 10th day, Wyatt called the bank directly and spoke to the loan officer who had handled his account during the two restructurings. The man was apologetic in the way that people are apologetic when their apology changes nothing. The file had been transferred. The process had a timeline. There was no provision in the terms for a pause based on the possibility that a vehicle might have value that had not yet been established. Wyatt thanked him and hung up. On the 13th day, the truck from Voss and Associates arrived at 7 in the morning. Two men in gray shirts worked through a clipboard inventory of everything in the garage, and Wyatt signed the seizure documentation with a pen that felt heavier than a pen had any reason to feel. He watched them hook the Charger to the flatbed without saying anything. He did not explain his father's warning. He did not describe the 11 years of leasing the space and paying the utility bill and checking the car every few weeks to make sure the tires still had air. He stood at the doorway of the garage and watched the truck carry it down the street. And when it turned the corner and was gone, he went inside and made coffee because there was nothing else to do. Kellerman Auto Salvage sat at the edge of Tulsa's Western Industrial Corridor, past the rail yard, and down a county road that turned to packed gravel about a quarter-mile before the gate. It was not a dramatic place. 3 acres of sorted wreckage, organized loosely by decade and make, with a small cinder-block office at the entrance and a hydraulic crusher at the far end that ran 2 mornings a week and shook the ground when it did. The Charger had been placed in the Friday processing lot, a section of the yard reserved for vehicles scheduled for the week's end compression run, positioned between a rusted pickup missing its entire cab roof and the rear half of a station wagon whose front had been removed so cleanly it suggested a professional separation. Isaac Nolan arrived at Kellerman on a Tuesday morning, as he did roughly twice a month, in search of a chrome trim strip and a specific rear differential housing for a Plymouth restoration he had been working on for the better part of 2 years. He was 62 years old and had the unhurried quality of a man who had never needed to perform urgency for anyone, moving through the yard with a canvas bag over one shoulder and a small flashlight clipped to his belt loop. He had worked as a senior authenticator for Barrett Jackson Auction Company for 8 years before stepping back from full-time employment, and in that time, he had examined over 4,000 vehicles for provenance verification. He had the ability, one that had become so natural, he no longer thought about it consciously, to notice the wrong thing, a proportion that did not belong, a finish that suggested a different manufacturing decision than the one officially recorded. He almost missed the Charger entirely. He was 3 rows over, working through a bin of chrome trim pieces, when something made him stop. It was the color, a specific shade of deep green that most people passing through the yard would have registered as dark green and moved on from. Isaac recognized it differently because he had read a specific line in a Hamtramck production document more than 20 years earlier, and the color had stayed with him, the way useful information stays with people who have organized their knowledge carefully. The designation in the factory records was Fate Green, a paint code applied to a narrow production run in the spring of 1969 with a slightly cool undertone that separated it from the standard dark greens available that model year. The Charger in the Friday lot had it. Isaac put the chrome piece back in the bin and walked over without hurrying. He spent a long time looking before he touched anything. The car was standard at first glance, full-size Charger, body platform, the fastback roofline that had made the model an icon in the years since. But as he moved along the driver's side, his eye fell into the habit of checking proportions against stored reference, and the discrepancies began to accumulate in the quiet way that evidence accumulates when it is real. The hood sat lower at the leading edge than it should have on a street configuration. Not by much, perhaps 3/8 of an inch, but consistently and uniformly, which meant it had been designed that way rather than settling over time. The rear wheel openings were slightly enlarged from the factory stamp line, and the metal edges were clean and original, not the work of a body shop after the fact. The front subframe, when Isaac crouched and looked underneath with his flashlight, showed reinforcement welds in locations that did not appear in any production diagram he had ever reviewed for standard commercial chargers. He moved to the driver's side door sill, pressed his cheek almost to the gravel, and angled the light beam upward into the gap between the sill and the frame rail. The stamp was there. It had been pressed into the raw steel before primer or undercoating was applied, and the decades of accumulated oil and grime had filled the impression like a mold, preserving the characters in fine, dark relief. 3 lines, small and deliberate. SO-2-3, /H69, /R code. Isaac read it 3 times without moving. Then he sat back on his heels and held still for almost 2 minutes. The SO prefix in Dodge factory notation indicated special order, a designation applied to vehicles built outside standard production parameters at the direct direction of Chrysler's Special Vehicles Group. The H69 suffix placed the assembly period in the spring run of 1969 at the Hamtramck, Michigan facility. The R code was the engine classification for the 426 cubic inch Hemi, the most powerful engine Chrysler had ever offered in a production vehicle, and one of the most celebrated power plants in American automotive history. But the combination of all 3 codes on a body vehicle, with the specific dimensional modifications Isaac had just cataloged, pointed to something that existed in the collector world primarily as legend. There had been a program known only among a small group of historians, longtime Mopar collectors, and 1 or 2 former Chrysler engineers who had spoken on the record only after retirement, in which Dodge had assembled a limited number of purpose-built superstock test vehicles at Hamtramck in the spring of Plash, 69, intended for a factory-supported drag racing effort that had been canceled without announcement before the competition season began. Most of the vehicles from the program had been destroyed in a storage fire or systematically dismantled for parts to avoid the paperwork complications of unofficial factory race cars. A small number had been sold off through informal internal channels without documentation, disappearing into private hands with no traceable history and no official acknowledgement that they had ever existed. The accepted estimate in the circles that knew about the program was that between 25 and 30 vehicles had been built. The number confirmed to still exist, at the moment Isaac was crouching on the gravel of Kellerman Auto Salvage, was 4. Isaac stood up slowly, brushed the dirt from his knees, and photographed the stamp from 4 angles. He photographed the hood gap, the rear wheel openings, and the subframe welds. He stood beside the car for another 20 minutes, working through the logic methodically, looking for the error he expected to find. He did not find one. He picked up his canvas bag and walked back to his truck without speaking to anyone, sat behind the wheel, and called Evelyn Cross in Scottsdale. Evelyn Cross had operated Meridian Classic Auctions for 9 years from a facility outside Scottsdale, Arizona, and had built it into one of the most consistently respected high-end automotive auction platforms in the country. She did not personally handle vehicles valued below $200,000, not out of arrogance, but because the infrastructure of her operation, the authentication staff, the climate-controlled storage, the relationships with international buyers, and the marketing apparatus that reached them made anything smaller a financial impracticality. She and Isaac had a professional history that went back 15 years, to the time he had authenticated a 1937 Cord for her first major sale, and they had maintained a working relationship since, transactional, built on mutual respect for competence, and without the social pretense that both of them found inefficient. When Isaac's call came through on a Tuesday morning, and she heard the measured quality in his voice, not excitement, which Isaac Nolan did not traffic in, but the specific careful pace of a man controlling his language, because what he was saying was consequential, she cleared the next 20 minutes from her calendar and listened. When he read her the stamp sequence, she was quiet for 3 seconds. She asked him whether he was certain about the subframe geometry. He told her he had photographs. She told him to send them, and she would review them that evening. She called him back at 10:15 that night and said she would be in Tulsa by Thursday. She arrived with her senior authenticator and a portable kit of non-destructive testing instruments, capable of measuring metal composition, weld characteristics, and paint substrate layers without cutting into the vehicle. The yard owner at Kellerman gave them access to the Friday lot without quite understanding what he was permitting, assuming it was a routine salvage assessment. The work took 4 hours. The factory stamp passed every available test. The metal composition around the impression was consistent with 1969 Hamtramck production steel, with no metallurgical evidence of later alteration or insertion. The VIN plate was absent, removed at some point in the car's history, almost certainly decades earlier. But a partial derivative stamp on the firewall corresponded to a production sequence that Isaac's records placed within the Hamtramck SO block. The Hemi engine remained in the car, seized and inert, but intact and matching the R code designation. Evelyn stood next to the Charger after the equipment was repacked and looked at it for a moment, the oxidized green paint under the flat sky of the salvage yard, the car sitting between two pieces of discarded metal that would be compressed into flat rectangles within 48 hours. Then she asked her assistant to find a current phone number for Wyatt Harmon. He did not answer the first call or the second. The third time, Evelyn left a voicemail that ran precisely 40 seconds, identifying herself and Meridian, describing the vehicle and its location, and stating that she believed the car had been substantially undervalued. Wyatt listened to the message 3 times at his kitchen table, with dinner going cold on the plate in front of him. He told himself it was probably a misunderstanding or some new category of scam he had not encountered yet. He called her back because he had spent 11 days exhausting every idea he had, and this was something he had not thought of. The conversation lasted 22 minutes. Evelyn described the stamp, the authentication, the historical context of the Hamtramck Superstock program, and the market range for a confirmed surviving example in the current collector environment, conservatively, $1.2 to $1.8 million, with the possibility of exceeding that figure if the documentation was thorough and the restoration was handled correctly. Wyatt said almost nothing until the end. His final question was simple: what happened next? Evelyn told him that the vehicle was currently in the physical custody of a civil asset recovery firm, that his legal ownership had not been extinguished by any court order, and that a conversation with the firm would need to happen before anything else could be set in motion. Wyatt said he understood. After the call ended, he sat without moving for several minutes, and then said quietly, to the empty kitchen, that he needed to talk to Charlotte Voss. He called her office the following morning, identified himself to the assistant, and asked for an in-person meeting, describing the purpose only as new information regarding the Harmon file. Charlotte agreed to the appointment at 2 in the afternoon, slotting it between 2 other meetings with the same efficiency she applied to everything, assigning it no particular significance. When Wyatt arrived, she was already in the conference room with a notepad and a pen, and the room was arranged exactly as it had been the first time. Her on one side, him on the other, the clean surface of the polished table between them. He sat down, placed a folder in front of him, and did not open it immediately. He said he had new information about the vehicle. Charlotte said she was listening. Wyatt opened the folder and slid 3 documents across the table in order: the authentication report from Evelyn's team, the preliminary appraisal summary, and the letter of intent from Meridian Classic Auctions confirming their interest in the vehicle for an upcoming Scottsdale sale. Charlotte read the documents in the order they had been placed before her. She read without looking up, her pen lying untouched across the top of her notepad. When she reached the appraisal summary and the figure at the bottom of the page conservative range, 1.2 to 1.8 million, she continued reading with the same pace, but the quality of her silence changed in a way that was difficult to name and impossible to ignore. She set the last page down with a movement that was fractionally slower than her usual handling of paper, a hesitation so small that someone who had not been watching for it would have missed it entirely. She said she would need to consult with her legal team before responding to any of the proposals in the documents. It was the correct thing to say, and the expected thing to say, and it told Wyatt nothing except that she had no intention of making anything straightforward. What she did not say, what her attorney confirmed to her privately within the hour of the meeting, was that the legal situation had become considerably more complex than a routine liquidation. The vehicle had not been sold, processed, or destroyed. It was sitting in the Friday lot at Kellerman, intact, and Wyatt Harmon's ownership had never been formally extinguished through any judicial order. The civil seizure authorization covered possession and liquidation. Liquidation had not yet occurred. There was a window, narrower than Charlotte would have preferred, in which the original owner retained legal standing. She returned to the conference room with a revised accounting. The original debt stood at $14,200. Recovery fees, administrative costs, field agent charges, 2 days of storage at the salvage facility, and what the revised sheet listed as processing overhead brought the adjusted obligation to $22,400. The figure had increased by more than 50% in the 72 hours since the car had been taken from Wyatt's garage. He looked at the itemized sheet without expression, then looked at the phone in the center of the table, where Evelyn Cross had joined the meeting by speaker. Evelyn said that Meridian Classic Auctions was prepared to advance the full amount of the adjusted debt as part of a formal consignment agreement, meaning Wyatt would owe nothing up front and Meridian would recover the advance from a percentage of the final auction proceeds. Charlotte said that she was not aware of any provision in the seizure authorization that required her firm to hold the vehicle pending private auction arrangements, and that the processing schedule at Kellerman was managed by the salvage contractor according to a calendar that was not within her authority to adjust. Isaac Nolan had been sitting at the far end of the conference table for the previous 40 minutes without speaking, his hands in his lap, watching the meeting the way a man watches a card game he already knows the outcome of. He placed both hands flat on the table, and without raising his voice or altering his posture, he asked Charlotte when exactly the Kellerman processing schedule for the Friday lot had been moved forward to Wednesday morning. The room was quiet, in the way rooms are quiet when a question removes every available response except the true one. Charlotte moved the papers in front of her, with the precise, deliberate motion of someone managing composure. Isaac did not wait for her to answer. He explained, without emphasis, that he had been at Kellerman that morning, a routine visit for a parts search, and the yard's operations manager had shown him an updated work order, stamped with the previous afternoon's date, that moved the Charger's processing from Friday's run to Wednesday at 8 in the morning, approximately 15 hours from the current moment. He had a photograph of the work order on his phone. He also noted, for the record, that he had placed a call before arriving at the meeting to an attorney in Dallas who had successfully argued preservation liability in a case involving a Shelby prototype in 2019, a situation in which a vehicle had been destroyed while authenticated documentation of its market value was in the formal possession of the party controlling it. The attorney had found the current situation interesting. Wyatt looked across the table at Charlotte and asked, in a voice that did not change pitch or volume from one word to the next, when she had known about the revised schedule. Charlotte said nothing. She looked at the documents in front of her, and the small adjustment she made, squaring their edges against each other with a fingertip, was the only movement in the room for several seconds. The meeting ended without a signed agreement, but the terms of the conversation had shifted in a direction that could not be reversed. Within 90 minutes of Wyatt and Isaac leaving the building, Charlotte's attorney had reached out to Evelyn's attorney in Scottsdale, and the two of them began working through the consignment and release documentation at a pace that Charlotte's office did not usually manage after business hours. Isaac drove from the meeting directly to Kellerman, spoke to the operations manager for a few minutes, and then stood at the entrance to the Friday lot and waited while the legal process completed itself in offices across the city. The consignment documentation was filed by 6 in the evening. The formal hold release was signed at 9:40 that night. Wyatt received a confirmation email at his kitchen table and read it twice without expression, then set the phone face down on the table and looked at the ceiling for a while before going to bed. At 7 in the morning on Friday, a specialty vehicle transport truck, the kind with padded interior restraints and enclosed housing, arrived at Kellerman Auto Salvage. The Friday processing run was scheduled to begin at 8. The Charger was loaded at 7:22, secured with padded strapping at 4 contact points, and covered with a transport blanket before the roll door closed. Wyatt was there with a cup of coffee he had stopped drinking well before the truck arrived. Isaac stood a few feet away, wearing the same flannel shirt and canvas bag as always, watching the loading crew work with the quiet approval of a man who had seen a great many things handled incorrectly and recognized when something was being handled right. The morning was cool and clear, the kind of October light in Tulsa that makes the edges of things look more defined than they usually do. And the two men watched the truck pull through the gate without speaking. After a moment, Isaac asked Wyatt where his father had found the car, which county, which auction, which year. Wyatt told him, Central Oklahoma, summer of 1987, $800, from a lot that had nothing else of note in it. Isaac listened, and when Wyatt finished, the older man nodded slowly and said that Raymond Harmon had known what he was looking at. He had simply had no way to prove it to anyone. Wyatt looked down the road where the truck had gone. He did not say anything. He drank the cold coffee and waited until the truck turned off the gravel road and disappeared behind the line of trees at the county road. And then he walked back to his van and drove home. The restoration took 11 weeks, carried out by Meridian's partner facility in Phoenix under Isaac's technical supervision. The engine was rebuilt by a specialist who had worked on Hemi race motors for 3 decades and who described the 426 as one of the cleaner cores he had seen come through the shop in years. Considering its circumstances, the body was stripped to bare metal and recoated in fate green, mixed to the original factory formula. The color as cool and specific in the Scottsdale light as it had been in the flat gray of Kellerman's lot. The provenance file assembled from Hamtramck production records, Isaac's 40 years of accumulated research documentation, and the full authentication report was compiled into a bound reference that Evelyn's staff described as among the most thorough they had processed for a vehicle of this classification. Wyatt made the trip to Phoenix 4 times during the restoration, staying in the same motel each time, spending his days in the shop doing whatever the team would let him do, organizing the documentation, cleaning parts, learning the technical language of a car he had lived beside for over a decade without understanding. On the last visit, he stood next to the finished vehicle under the shop's fluorescent lights and did not say anything for a long time. Nobody asked him to. The Scottsdale auction was held on a Saturday in December, in a venue that seated 400 guests, with standing room along the perimeter walls for another 200. Evelyn introduced the vehicle with a presentation that ran 8 minutes, covering the factory stamp, the Hamtramck Superstock program, the authentication findings, and the significance of the car's survival, one of 5 confirmed examples of a vehicle that had nearly been erased from history twice, once by its original manufacturer and once by a salvage yard's processing schedule. Bidding opened at $800,000. Within 4 minutes, the number had crossed 1 million. It moved more slowly above 1.4 million, 3 bidders exchanging advances in increments of 20,000, and the hammer came down at $1,650,000 to a private collector from Texas who had flown in the previous day and conducted the entire bidding process with the same minimal expression he would have used ordering from a menu. Wyatt was standing at the back of the hall. He was wearing the cleanest shirt he owned, which was a dark blue flannel he generally reserved for estimates on commercial jobs. He did not look like a man watching something worth $1.65 million sold on his behalf. He looked like a man who had been asked to confirm something he had half believed for a long time and was now finally being given the evidence. After Meridian's commission, the consignment advance recovery, transport and storage costs, restoration investment, legal fees, and associated expenses were deducted, Wyatt received a wire transfer of $1,082,000. It arrived in his account on a Tuesday morning in January, and he checked the balance on his phone 3 times before driving to the bank and asking the branch manager to confirm that the number he was looking at was real. He said it the way people say things they already know the answer to but need to hear out loud. He sat in the bank's lobby for a few minutes after the conversation, in a chair near the front window with the kind of stillness that looks from the outside like a man doing nothing and which is from the inside something much harder to describe. The first payment he made from the proceeds was not to a tax attorney, though he hired one within the week. It was not to a financial planner, though he hired one shortly after. It was a check for exactly $14,200, not $22,000, not the inflated revised figure from Charlotte's accounting, but the precise original debt balance, as it had existed before the additional fees were applied, made out to Charlotte Voss and Associates, and sent by certified post. There was no cover letter enclosed. There was no note of any kind. There was only the check, for the original amount, which was everything he had owed and nothing more. Charlotte received the envelope on a Thursday, opened it at her desk between two other pieces of correspondence, and looked at the number for a moment before setting it in the processing inbox. She had enough experience to understand exactly what the number communicated. He had not paid the inflated total, and he had not contested it in any court or formal proceeding. He had paid the original debt and drawn a clean line there, which was, in its own precise and unhurried way, the most complete statement anyone had made throughout the entire affair. In February, Wyatt renewed the lease on the garage. He did not fill it right away. He parked the new truck he had bought in the driveway, and for several weeks the garage sat mostly empty, the tools organized along the back wall, the work light on its hook, the floor swept and bare. One evening in early spring, he was in there sorting some pipe fittings when he stopped and looked at the far corner. On the concrete where the Charger had sat for 11 years, there was a faint rectangular shadow, the oil and road grime that had seeped from the car over decades, absorbed into the porous surface and left there permanently in an outline that matched the car's footprint exactly. It was not something that could be cleaned, not with anything short of grinding the concrete itself. He stood and looked at it for a while, the way a person looks at something that is not sad and not happy, but is simply true. Raymond Harmon had told him not to sell the car until he knew what it was. He had not sold it. He had come close to losing it, and then the world had been reminded, at some cost and inconvenience to several people, that not knowing the value of a thing does not change what the thing is worth. Some things do not require anyone's confirmation to be real. They simply wait in the dark for the right set of eyes and the right angle of light, and they go on being what they are until that moment arrives. Wyatt turned off the garage light, locked the door, and walked back across the dark driveway to the house.